Hi, welcome back to Psychology as a Human Science here at the University of West Georgia. This video will be the third one in a series that's going to focus on humanistic psychology, which, as we've noted, is one sector of psychology as a human science, which is our topic matter for this semester. In the last video in this series, we took a look a little bit at the qualitative nature of the research paradigm adopted most of the time by humanistic psychology. Then we took a look at the theme of human potential and self-actualization. Adjust my hat here. Then we took a look at the theme of human potential and self-actualization as it appears within humanistic psychology, and we noted that it is a pretty big and recurrent theme for sure. And a little bit of what I did in the last video was probably on the order of an exhortation more so than an explanation of self-actualization. So in other words, I was trying to invite you to understand it, especially by relating it to the reality of your own life and possibly beginning to self-actualize yourself a little bit. Okay, in this video what we have on the plate is we're going to be looking at three of the most famous humanistic psychologists and noting a little bit of their specialized vocabulary. So let's start out with that. In your notes, the three biggest thinkers within humanistic psychology, notice that there are a lot of names and words in big, bold letters, as though I might ask you about this on the test, and by the way, I will. Okay, so first one, probably the most internationally renowned humanistic psychologist of all, nominated for a Nobel Prize, I think at one point, didn't win it, but nominated for it, Carl Rogers. And the thing about Carl Rogers is, first thing you ought to know is a big recurrent emphasis on clinical psychology and psychotherapy. Yes, he wrote books on some other topics. He wrote a famous book on the nature of education called Freedom to Learn, but always in the background are the insights that he gleaned from his practice of psychotherapy and his consequent understanding of human nature. So, big emphasis on clinical psychology and psychotherapy. So the name of his school of psychotherapy is called client-centered therapy. It's also known as person-centered therapy. I didn't write that in your notes, but there it is. Okay, so person-centered therapy has to do with offering the client, the person receiving the therapy, a very particular kind of presence, and the long phrase used to describe that is unconditional positive regard. And actually, if you break that phrase apart, it more or less tells you what's going on. So positive regard means seeing the client in a positive light despite the client's shortcomings, despite the fact that the client is maybe not saying things that you as the therapist necessarily want to hear, or who has values that you as the therapist don't necessarily agree with. It has to do with valuing the client unconditionally, in other words, irrespective of all of that kind of stuff, like valuing the client as a unique and distinct human being who's struggling probably with various issues and struggling with life at some fundamental level, but still nonetheless is a valuable participant in the human race. To honor and value the client's presence is basically what unconditional positive regard is about. More specifically, it has to do with offering a very accepting presence. You're probably already getting that idea. An empathetic presence, that means really trying to understand the client's world as he or she sees it. Okay, and finally, a very honest type of environment. So those three characteristics are important. So acceptance, empathy, and honesty. Okay, there's three of them. All right, so the client can eventually grow beyond his or her problems and impediments and eventually enter into his or her deeper possibilities. And at this point, you're probably inferring, hey, wait a minute, that sounds like a connection to the previous video when we were talking about self-actualization. And yeah, you're exactly right about that. In fact, I'm impressed that you thought that through so quickly and so accurately. I am impressed with you, the tuition-paying West Georgia student. So yes, there is a connection between self-actualization and client-centered therapy, because ultimately what client-centered therapy is about is assisting the client on his or her way toward actualizing whatever he or she can possibly be in this life. In other words, self-actualizing. Okay, so that's in a very small nutshell, tiny nutshell, Carl Rogers and client-centered therapy. There's a lot more to it, of course, once you get into the details of it. If you want to hear more about that, you might consider taking Psychology 4000. That's a bit of a shameless plug because I teach that class later in your career, possibly. I don't know, maybe next semester if it fits into your schedule. At any rate, or you can look on YouTube. I've got like all the lecture videos on YouTube now for that class. So, an accepting, empathetic, honest environment. Okay, so great. I think you sort of get the hang of that. Let me say one more thing about Carl Rogers. It's not in the notes, but it may be it may pique your interest a little bit in this guy. When we talk about empathy in a clinical way, or even more generally in life, in other words, really trying to understand and see the world from someone else's point of view, that's not what we typically do with each other. Okay? Typically, we don't actually understand each other from Carl Rogers' point of view. What we're doing is we're judging each other and then confusing our judgments with actual understanding. Okay, so that's what typically goes on. So if you ever get the feeling that hardly anyone understands you in life, there's a real reason for that. That is not just a fantasy that you're necessarily making up. And the reason is that we hardly ever understand each other. And the reason why is because we're too busy judging each other and then in a pretty much self-congratulatory way, confusing our judgments with actual understanding. But what actual understanding is about is not just sort of casting our judgments from on high onto other people. What it's about is making a real honest effort to see the world as other people see the world, even if you don't agree with them. Okay? That's where it gets tough. See, if you agree with someone, it's sort of easy to see the world from their point of view, because your point of view more or less is like that. But when someone has a really different point of view, that's where the challenge is. Okay, so little sidebar moment, possibly, a little elaboration on Carl Rogers. So the next guy, Abraham Maslow, we've already mentioned his name in passing because this is the guy that was famous for that idea of self-actualization. So he's the one that came up with the phrase and talked a lot about it. So big emphasis on Maslow is not going to be clinical psychology. It's going to be motivation and personality, which if you think about it, those are interrelated things, because how you're characteristically motivated in various ways is probably fairly obviously an element of your personality. Okay, so Maslow's biggest claim to fame, which is hopefully something maybe you heard about in your intro psych class, because it's featured in a lot of intro psych textbooks, is the hierarchy of needs, which is a theory of how our motivations unfold over time. And the basic idea is that we take care of our most primitive physiological needs first, and once we have that more or less together, once we feel safe and secure and we have a belly full of food and all that kind of stuff, only then do we start to work on our psychological needs a little bit higher up the pyramid, right? Which is how this theory is usually presented in intro textbooks, or in any textbook for that matter. And once we have our psychological needs met, for instance, we have a decent sense of connection with other human beings, we feel accepted, we have a sense of love and belonging, more or less. It doesn't have to be perfect, but more or less. Then we work toward, at the uppermost part of the pyramid, self-actualization needs, which of course have to do with how we've already characterized self-actualization, which is glimpsing and ultimately realizing our deepest potential as the unique human beings that we are. Oftentimes, self-actualization needs, did I see this in your notes? No, I did not say this in your notes, but oftentimes they can include what he calls peak experiences, which have to do with sort of the most intense, sort of overwhelming experiences of things like union with the cosmos, or communion with God, or a deep sense of spirituality, or feeling the oneness of all things in an intense, overwhelming way. So self-actualization can be in a kind of intimate alignment with these peak experiences, which once again, it's not in your notes, so I won't ask you about it on the test, but it might pique your interest a little bit in a thinker like Abraham Maslow. And finally, Rollo May. By the way, all these guys are American that we're talking about, so they're all humanistic psychology. I mentioned this in the last video, is a distinctly American approach to psychology. So Rollo May, a focus on existential psychology and psychotherapy. Okay, so maybe that's a word you haven't sort of encountered in everyday life, but existential means with respect to the philosophy of existentialism, which in turn has to do with exploring the nature of existence. It kind of has the word existence in it, and that's how I would suggest that you start to understand it. It's a philosophy of existence, this time by way of Rollo May, applied to the project of psychology. Okay, so it's a kind of hybrid, or a kind of intersection between those two modes of thought. So, as I said in your notes, it's based upon the philosophy of existentialism, which is very much a European mode of philosophy, or as they like to say, continental philosophy, which means it hails from the continent of Europe and not from England and Ireland, and it mostly comes to us by way of Germany and France. Okay, so those two countries especially, although the other continental European countries contribute to it too. Okay, so the philosophy of existentialism, which seeks to explore and illuminate the fundamental nature of human existence. We've already said that. Okay, so very quickly and briefly, just so you get kind of the idea of it, the three most famous humanistic psychologists. Now, in the next segment of the video, which will be the final segment of the video, this is going to set us up for the next video after this, which will focus on phenomenological psychology. So, and that's a long word, and probably it tripped you up to hear it a little bit. So, in your notes, let's slow down a little bit. Another linkage to philosophy would be humanistic psychology's affinity with phenomenology, is how you say that long word. Okay, so phenomenology is another mode of continental philosophy related to existentialism. In fact, to an extent they overlap, because there's such a thing as existential phenomenology. But at any rate, phenomenology is a school of philosophical thought that emphasizes reflectively exploring our subjective experience. Oh my goodness, this is making sense to you, I hope. Because remember, when we were characterizing humanistic psychology, big emphasis on subjective experience and exploring the nature of subjective experience. Well, guess what? Phenomenology was a mode of thinking and reflecting that was already established, that was already doing that same basic project, and to a large extent, humanistic psychology used that along with existential thinking as its philosophical foundation. All right, so phenomenology, okay, I'll restart it, is a school of philosophical thought that emphasizes reflectively exploring our subjective experience to reveal its underlying structure or meaning. And then on the next page, notice that this is the same basic description we gave to humanistic psychology's research method. Yeah, there's a reason for that, and the reason is because these early humanistic psychologists were very much influenced by these modalities of continental philosophy, especially phenomenology and especially existentialism. And phenomenology provided sort of an easy method or way of gaining insight into the nature of our subjective experience. So lo and behold, it was very quickly absorbed and incorporated into humanistic psychology. So here's a way of talking about it. Humanistic psychology's research method is often, but not always, you're probably getting sick of hearing that qualified way of saying it, phenomenological in nature. Boom. So it usually has to do with illuminating the psychological meaning of experience. Experience is the central construct in phenomenology, the central basic datum in phenomenologically oriented, qualitative, humanistic psychological research. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, big idea. You definitely need to know that for the test. Okay, so, all right, the next little bit I've already said, but here it is to run in parallel with your notes to help things seem orderly and coherent for you. A combination of phenomenology and existentialism, which overlap somewhat, I've already said all that, basically constitute the philosophical foundation of humanistic psychology. Oh, that's an easy sort of slam dunk question for the test coming up. So if I ask you about the the two modes of continental thinking that form the philosophical foundation of humanistic psychology, you ought to be able to trot out without a whole lot of effort. Well, that would be phenomenology and existentialism, wouldn't it? Yes, yes. There's your A for that question. So both existentialism and phenomenology, I think fairly obviously, embody a post-positivistic point of view. I'm laughing a little bit because it's at how true that is. You know, it's almost like I'm not even saying it strongly enough. Let me recast the sentence in a stronger way. Both existentialism and phenomenology embody a wildly post-positivistic point of view on the nature of reality, especially reality in terms of how we actually experience it. And then the very last thing in your notes, which is meant to give a transition to the next segment of material where we're going to stop talking about humanistic psychology and we're going to start talking about phenomenological psychology in its own right, okay? However, phenomenology and existentialism have given birth to psychological schools in their own right. Let's look at them next. And with that, I'm going to leave you hanging in suspense with bated breath for the next video in this series. And until then, I hope you have a great day. I hope you have a wonderful one. It looks so sunny and hot out here in the middle of July, which is when I'm making this videos in anticipation of a coronavirus semester in the fall. Whatever's going on for you, have a good one. Take care now.